My husband took out a $2 million life insurance policy on me. Then my daughter whispered, "Mom, we have to run." That was the moment I knew my life was in danger. I was in his study one quiet afternoon, looking for a missing utility bill, when I came across a folder tucked deep inside the drawer. The papers inside weren't bills at all. They were insurance documents with my name written across them, declaring me the insured. The payout was staggering, $2 million. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, trying to understand why my husband would make such a decision without even mentioning it to me. Before I could process it, Mira came to me late that night, her eyes wide with fear. She had overheard her father on the phone. His voice was low, but the words carried clearly through the thin wall. "She won't see it coming," he said. Those words stuck in her mind like knives. She ran into my room, trembling, and grabbed my arm. "We have to run, Mom," she whispered. I looked at her, my heart racing, and saw how terrified she was. She was only a teenager, but in her voice I heard the urgency of someone who understood danger better than she should have. Betrayal hit me harder than anything I had ever felt before. This was the man I had trusted, the man I had shared my life with, and now I realized he might be planning something unthinkable. I sat frozen for a long moment, staring at my daughter, holding her hand tightly, as if letting go would make the ground fall away from beneath us. In that instant, everything changed. Alara could not ignore the changes that had been creeping into her marriage. Grayson was not the man she had once known. The warmth that used to live in his voice was gone, replaced by a strange coldness that lingered even in the smallest conversations. Where he once smiled easily, he now seemed guarded, almost calculating. He spent long hours behind closed doors, and whenever she walked past his study, she felt as though something was being hidden from her. He had grown secretive about money. Bank statements that used to be left openly on the kitchen counter had disappeared. When she asked small questions about bills or expenses, he would brush her off with quick, clipped answers. "Don't worry about it," he would say, always followed by a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was clear he didn't want her to see what was happening with their finances, and that wall of silence between them grew heavier by the day. The control started in small ways. Grayson began locking his office door, a habit he had never had before. He started checking her phone records, asking why she called certain people or how long the conversations lasted. Once, when she returned from visiting her sister, he asked about her route and pressed for unnecessary details, as though he was tracking her every move. He even started noticing her car mileage, making comments like, "You drove farther than you said." It felt less like a marriage and more like surveillance. Then came the suggestions, the kind that seemed innocent on the surface but made her stomach tighten. He began urging her to take up riskier activities. "We should try hiking those cliffs near the lake," he said one evening, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Another time, he suggested she drive at night by herself to clear her mind. At first, she brushed them off as odd attempts to shake up their routine. But soon, she understood there was more to it. They weren't ideas for adventure, they were invitations for danger. Mira saw it too. She had always been observant, and lately, she couldn't ignore the way her father's gaze followed her mind. He didn't look at Alara with love anymore. He looked at her the way someone looks at a clock they're waiting on, as if he were counting down to something. Mira caught him watching from the corner of his eye, his stare heavy and unsettling, and the unease in her young face only deepened Alara's dread. The realization came slowly but firmly. This wasn't about love or a marriage gone sour. This was about something darker. Grayson no longer treated her like a partner. He treated her like a liability that could turn into an opportunity. His gestures, his words, his distance, all pointed to one conclusion that chilled her to the bone. He didn't want a life with her anymore. What he wanted was the reward that would come the day she was gone. Alara sat with that truth pressing against her chest, heavier than any fear she had known before. The man who once promised to protect her now looked at her as if she were nothing more than a means to an end. And in that cruel shift, she understood her safety was already slipping away. Alara knew she couldn't confront Grayson. He was too sharp, too careful, and she feared that one wrong word would expose her suspicions. If he sensed that she knew anything, she might not get another chance to protect herself or Mira. So she forced herself to smile when he was around, to nod at his stories, and to keep her voice steady even when her heart raced. Inside, though, she was already moving in silence, step by step. The first thing she did was gather cash. She started pulling small amounts from grocery money, tucking away a few bills at a time so it wouldn't be noticeable. She hid the money inside a folded sweater on the top shelf of her closet. Each time she added to the pile, it gave her a small sense of control, even if the fear still outweighed. Next, she found a cheap prepaid phone. She bought it on the way back from work one afternoon, using cash so there would be no record. She kept it hidden in an old purse at the back of her closet. It wasn't much, but she needed a way to call for help if she had to leave quickly. The bag came last. It was small, but she filled it with essentials: A few clothes, important documents she quietly pulled from the safe, Myra's birth certificate, and basic toiletry. She didn't want it to look suspicious, so she kept it folded inside her luggage, where Grayson would never think to look. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the beginning of an escape. Myra helped in her own quiet way. She started slipping food into her school backpack: crackers, granola bars, bottles of water. She told her mother she wanted them, just in case. And though her voice tried to sound casual, her eyes gave away the weight she was carrying. Alara hated that her daughter had to think this way, but she also knew they had no choice. Survival meant being ready for the moment when they would have to leave without warning. Meanwhile, Grayson carried on as though everything was normal. At the dinner table, he would talk about new investments he was working on, painting a picture of a future that sounded secure and prosperous. His tone was calm, but the look in his eyes was detached, distant, as if none of it was really about family or stability. Alara listened carefully, her face composed, but every word he spoke tightened the knot in her chest. The hardest part for her was the conflict that lived inside. She remembered the man she had once loved, the man who had promised her a life built on trust and partnership. They had dreamed together of a home filled with joy, of a future for Myra that would be safe and full of opportunity. But now, every dream she had once built with him felt poisoned. What used to represent hope now felt like a death sentence hanging over her head. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing beside her. On the outside, she was still the wife who kept the household running. On the inside, she was a woman preparing for war, quietly, carefully, with no room for mistakes. Grayson came home one evening with a forced brightness in his voice. He sat at the table, talking as though he was making a generous offer. "We should get away for the weekend," he said. "Just the three of us. There's this canyon a few hours out. Quiet, peaceful, perfect for a little break." He smiled, but the smile didn't touch his eyes. To anyone else, it would have sounded like a thoughtful suggestion, but to Alara, it sent a cold shiver down her spine. Later that night, Myra slipped into her mother's room again. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly as if holding back fear. She whispered what she had overheard. Grayson had been on the phone in his office. His voice was low, but Myra caught the words clearly. "It'll look like an accident." Alara felt her heart stop. The world around her blurred, and it was hard to breathe. There was no longer space for doubt, no room to tell herself she might be wrong. Grayson wasn't just dangerous. He was already planning the moment, the place, the excuse. The canyon wasn't a trip, it was a trap. She stayed calm in front of Myra, but inside she was trembling. Every instinct screamed at her that time was running out. If she hesitated, if she ignored this final warning, it could cost her everything. She looked at her daughter, who was staring back with eyes full of trust and fear, and she knew she couldn't wait another day. That night, while Grayson slept, Alara lay awake, listening to his steady breathing. She turned her head slightly, watching his silhouette in the dim light. To anyone else, he would look peaceful, like a man resting after a long day. But to her, he was a stranger lying in the same bed, a man waiting for her to take one wrong step so he could cash in on her death. She leaned close to Myra when they were alone and spoke in a hushed tone. "We're leaving before dawn," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she held her daughter's. "Don't tell anyone. Don't pack anything that will make him suspicious. Just be ready." Myra nodded quickly, her small face tight with determination. She didn't argue or cry. She just whispered back, "Okay, Mom." In that moment, Alara saw how much her daughter had grown. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was carrying the same weight, the same fear, but also the same will to survive. Alara closed her eyes that night, but sleep never came. She counted the hours, listening to the clock tick slowly in the silence of their home. Every sound, the creak of the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, felt louder than usual. She kept glancing at the bag she had packed, hidden away, ready to be grabbed in seconds. Morning couldn't come fast enough. She knew that once the sun rose, they would have to act quickly and quietly. If Grayson even suspected what she was planning, there would be no escape. The house was silent when Alara opened her eyes. The clock read a little after 4. She moved carefully, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Myra was already awake, sitting up with her small backpack by her side, ready just like her mother had told her. Without a word, Alara gave her a nod, and together they stepped out of the bedroom, careful not to make the floorboards creak. They left their phones on the nightstand. Alara knew Grayson checked locations, and if they carried them, it would only lead him straight to them. With her bag slung over her shoulder, she guided Myra out the back door, shutting it slowly until the lock clicked into place. The air outside was cold, the kind that woke every nerve in her body. Her old car sat at the edge of the driveway. It wasn't reliable, and it only had half a tank of gas, but it was all they had. She slid behind the wheel, her hands trembling as she turned the key. For a terrifying second, The engine sputtered before finally starting. Mira climbed into the seat beside her, clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. They pulled onto the road while the world was still dark. Streetlights glowed faintly, and the silence of the early morning wrapped around them. Alara's eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights she saw made her stomach twist. She imagined Grayson behind them, closing the distance, ready to drag them back before they could escape. Mira reached over, her small fingers curling around her mother's hand on the gearshift. "Don't look back," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eye. Those words gave Alara strength. She pressed harder on the gas and kept her eyes forward, mile after mile. The road stretched endlessly, each town passing in a blur. The old car rattled on the highway, and the fuel gauge dropped lower with every passing hour. Alara calculated silently, praying the gas would last long enough to cross the state line. She didn't dare stop for long, only pulling into one small station at dawn, paying with cash and keeping her head down. By the time they reached Callan's place, exhaustion clung to her bone. His house stood on the edge of a quiet street, paint peeling on the porch, but to her it looked like a fortress. She parked in the driveway, her hands still gripping the steering wheel long after the engine turned off. Callan opened the door with a look of surprise that quickly turned into concern. Alara hadn't seen him in years, not since a fight had pulled them apart. But the moment he saw her face, pale and strained, he stepped aside without a word. Mira hurried inside first, and Alara followed, the weight of everything crashing down at once. As soon as the door shut behind them, her legs gave way. She sank into a chair at the kitchen table, tears spilling faster than she could stop them. Her voice broke as she confessed everything. What she had found, what Mira had heard, the trip to the canyon, the danger that had driven them here. Callan listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with anger. For the first time in weeks, Alara felt a flicker of safety, though fear still lingered. She had escaped the house, but she knew the fight was far from over. It didn't take long for Grayson to realize they were gone. The calls started within days. Alara's mother rang first, confused and worried. "Grayson says you've had some kind of breakdown," she said. "He told us you ran away without explaining anything." Alara's chest tightened at the words. She could hear the doubt in her mother's tone, the way the lies were already working their way into her family's thoughts. He called her sister next, saying Alara was unwell and making reckless choices. The story spread quickly, and soon her relatives were leaving messages, some pleading for her to come home, others frustrated that she wasn't answering. Grayson had twisted the truth into something ugly, painting himself as the victim and her as the unstable wife who had abandoned her responsibility. The worst moment came when he showed up at Callan's house. Alara was in the kitchen when she heard the sharp knock at the front door. Her body froze. She knew that knock. Mira grabbed her hand, her small fingers trembling. Callan walked past them, his jaw set like stone, and opened the door just wide enough to look Grayson in the eye. Grayson's voice carried into the house. "I need to talk to my wife," he said, calm but edged with menace. "She's sick, and she's putting our daughter in danger. You don't understand what's going on." Alara couldn't breathe. For a moment, she thought Callan might let him in. But then her brother's voice cut through, sharp and unshakable. "Get off my porch," he said. "You're not fooling anyone." When Grayson tried to push again, Callan slammed the door so hard the walls shook. He turned back to Alara, his face red with anger. "He won't stop," he said. "He wants the money more than his own family." Hearing those words from her brother confirmed what Alara already knew, but hated to admit. She wasn't just running from a bad marriage. She was running from a man who saw her as a prize to be collected. The idea made her feel like prey, hunted and cornered. Even here, in what should have been a safe space, she could feel his shadow pressing against the walls. But this time, she wasn't alone. Callan stood solidly beside her, no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his loyalty. For years, they had barely spoken, but now the bond of family was stronger than the rift that had once separated. He wouldn't let Grayson through that door, not now, not ever. Sitting at the kitchen table that night, Callan spoke plainly. "You can't just keep running," he said. "If you stay in hiding, he'll find a way to twist this against you. You need to hit back. You need to prove what he's doing." Alara looked at him, her heart torn between fear and resolve. She had spent weeks preparing to escape, but escape alone would never be enough. If she wanted a real life for herself and Mira, she couldn't hide forever. She needed to stand up and make sure Grayson could never come after them again. Alara knew Callan was right. Running could only keep them safe for so long. If Grayson wasn't stopped, he would never let go. The next step was terrifying, but she had no choice. She needed legal help. Callan reached out to a local attorney he trusted, a woman named Marissa Cole, who had a reputation for handling complex estate and fraud cases. The first meeting was quiet and tense. Alara sat across from Marissa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she explained everything she had discovered. Marissa listened carefully, never interrupting, her sharp eyes flicking between Alara and Callan as the story unfolded. When Alara finished, Marissa leaned forward and spoke firmly. "We can build a case, but it has to be done carefully. If he suspects you're collecting proof, he might move faster. We'll take it one step at a time." With Marissa's guidance, Alara began collecting documents. She still had copies of the insurance papers she had found in the study, and Marissa instructed her to secure them properly. Together, they dug into financial records. With quiet persistence, Marissa uncovered accounts Grayson had hidden, funds he had shifted around that didn't match their household income. Every record added to the trail, painting a picture of a man preparing for a payout. Phone records were next. With legal channels, Marissa obtained logs showing the late-night calls Grayson had made to numbers linked to brokers and associates. The timing lined up too neatly with Myra's memory of hearing him whisper about an accident. It was another piece of the puzzle, one more strand in the web he had spun. Mira, though young, was brave enough to step forward. She sat in Marissa's office with her hands folded and spoke clearly about what she had overheard, the chilling sentence her father had spoken on the phone. "It'll look like an accident." Her voice shook only slightly, but she didn't waver. Alara's heart ached watching her daughter carry such a heavy burden, but her pride grew alongside the pain. Mira was stronger than anyone had given her credit for. Callan played his part as well. He reached out to an old friend of Grayson's, a man who at first avoided the conversation. With steady persistence, Callan pressed him until the truth slipped out. Grayson had been boasting about his future, hinting that he was about to be set for life. The man didn't want to get involved, but even that reluctant admission was valuable. It confirmed that Grayson had spoken openly about a windfall he expected soon, one that couldn't be explained by any legitimate work. Piece by piece, the case began to take shape. It wasn't complete, but it was growing stronger. Each document, each statement, each whispered truth formed a chain linking Grayson's lies to his intentions. Alara felt the weight of secrecy every day, the fear that one slip could alert him, but she also felt the steady hand of progress guiding her forward. Patience was the hardest part. She wanted to be free immediately, to put the nightmare behind her. But Marissa reminded her again and again, a case like this takes time. If we rush, he walks away. If we wait, we bring him down. Alara nodded each time, holding on to the hope that the work they were doing in silence would one day be the key to their freedom. Alara's hands shook as she dialed Grayson's number. She forced her voice to sound steady, practiced the words she and Marissa had agreed on. "I don't want to keep running from you," she said softly. "Maybe we can talk, just the two of us. I think I was wrong to leave." There was a pause on the line, then his smooth voice came through, filled with triumph. "I knew you'd come around," he said. They agreed to meet at a diner just off the highway. On the day of the meeting, Alara dressed simply, her expression calm though her stomach twisted. Callan drove her there, but stayed parked at a distance with Marissa. They had arranged everything carefully. Marissa had the recording equipment ready, and Callan's eyes never left the diner doors. Alara walked inside alone, carrying nothing but her purse and the courage she had pieced together from weeks of fear. Grayson was already at a booth, leaning back with the kind of smug confidence that made her skin crawl. He stood when he saw her, spreading his arms as if he expected a warm welcome. Alara gave him a small, strained smile and slid into the seat across from him. "I've missed you," he said, his voice low and syrupy. "You and Mira belong with me." Alara kept her gaze down, letting him believe she was ashamed. "Maybe I overreacted," she murmured. "Maybe I was just scared. You've always had plans for us. I should have trusted you." His grin widened. "Exactly. I was only thinking of our future. I told you before, everything I do is to make sure we're taken care of." She nodded slowly, playing the role she had rehearsed. "If you still want to go on that canyon trip, I'll come. Maybe it will help us start over." The words lit up his face with satisfaction. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You see? That's all I wanted. One trip, one chance to fix everything. After that, life will be easier than you can imagine." Alara forced herself not to recoil. Every word he spoke was dripping with the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won. She glanced toward the window, knowing Marissa and Callan were listening from the car, recording every syllable. Grayson went on, unable to hide his excitement. "You'll see, Alara. After that trip, we'll be set for life. No more bills, no more stress. Just freedom. I've lined it all up perfectly." Her heart pounded, but she kept her expression soft, almost submissive. "I believe you," she whispered. He smirked then, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "You won't regret it." His tone was careless, full of pride. In that moment, he said far more than he should have, enough to prove what Marissa needed for the case. When the meeting ended, Alara excused herself with a faint smile and walked out of the diner. The moment she stepped into the sunlight, Callan was at her side, steadying her as her legs threatened to give out. Marissa's calm voice followed. "We've got it. He just sealed his own fate." For the first time, Alara felt a shift. The trap had worked. The morning the evidence was handed over, Alara felt the weight of months pressing on her chest. Marissa carried the files like weapons. Every paper, every record, every clip of Grayson's voice carefully organized. The detective listened as the recording played, Grayson's own smug words filling the room. His voice, once charming, now sounded like a noose tightening around him. Alongside it were the policy documents with his signature, the secret accounts showing hidden transfers, and Myra's quiet but steady testimony. Piece by piece, the picture became undeniable. The authorities did not waste time. Within days, they opened a full investigation. Grayson was questioned, his confidence faltering for the first time when officers pressed him about the canyon trip. He tried to laugh it off, tried to paint Alara as paranoid, but the evidence was stronger than his lies. The recording stripped away his mask. The investigators saw what he truly was, a man who placed wealth above his own family's lives. When the arrest came, Alara was at Callan's house. She saw the flashing lights through a news report hours later. Grayson stood in handcuffs, shouting as officers led him to the car. His suit was wrinkled, his face red with fury, but there was no escaping now. The charges were heavy: insurance fraud, conspiracy, and attempted harm. The same man who once controlled every room he entered now looked small and powerless. The trial was long and draining. Alara sat through each day, listening to lawyers pick apart his actions, listening to witnesses speak. Callan's friend testified about Grayson's bragging. Myra's trembling voice carried across the courtroom, recounting the night she heard him say, "She won't see it coming." Each word from her daughter felt like both a knife and a shield, painful yet powerful. Grayson tried to defend himself, but the walls had closed in. His charm no longer worked, his manipulations exposed for all to see. Colleagues distanced themselves, friends disappeared, and his once shining reputation crumbled in front of everyone. The man who lived for control was stripped of it piece by piece, until all that remained was his guilt. On the final day, Alara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had come into this courtroom as someone who had been hunted, cornered, and nearly destroyed. Now she sat taller, stronger. The judge's words rang out clear and final. Grayson was guilty. His sentence meant years behind bars, and with it, the end of his grip on her. Alara turned her head slightly, catching Myra's eyes. The girl leaned close and whispered, her voice barely above breath, "We're safe now, Mom." Those simple words washed over Alara like sunlight after a storm. For the first time in months, she felt her lungs fill with air that wasn't tainted by fear. As the gavel struck, Alara realized she was no longer just surviving. She had fought back. She had won. And beside her, Mira smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. The months after the trial felt like breathing for the first time in years. Alara and Mira moved into a modest house on the edge of town. It wasn't large, and the walls still smelled faintly of fresh paint, but to them it was a palace. There were no locked drawers, no suspicious glances, no fear of footsteps in the hallway. For the first time, every corner felt safe. Mira decorated her small bedroom with posters and books, her laughter drifting through the walls as she hummed to herself. Alara found comfort in simple routines, watering the little garden, cooking dinner without glancing over her shoulder, sitting with her daughter on the porch during quiet evening. Their new life was not grand, but it was theirs. At night, when Mira slept, Alara often sat by the window and thought about the path that had brought them here. The betrayal had almost broken her. The man she once trusted with everything had turned into a stranger, and worse, a predator. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything. Yet, instead of crumbling, she discovered a strength that had always been buried deep inside. That strength had carried her through whispers in the dark, through long drives filled with fear, and through the courtroom where truth finally prevailed. It had not been easy, and scars still lingered, but those scars no longer felt like chains. They were reminders of survival. Mira, too, had grown stronger. She carried herself with quiet courage, the kind that only comes from standing at the edge of danger and choosing to fight against it. Sometimes she slipped her hand into Alara's and said, "We're okay now," and each time it brought tears to Alara's eyes. The house filled slowly with new memories. Burnt pancakes from Myra's first attempt at breakfast. Laughter over a board game on a rainy night. Long talks about dreams for the future. There was no luxury, but there was warmth, something money could never buy. Alara no longer thought of herself as a victim. She was someone who had been betrayed, but refused to let betrayal define her. She had faced a man who valued money over love, and proved he could not win. She had shown Mira that even in the darkest moments, hope could be rebuilt. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft colors, Alara whispered to herself the truth she had carried all along. "The policy he took on my life became the reason I finally claimed it back." And in that quiet moment, she knew they were free.